Chapter 21, The Crimson Chorus and the Shattered Tuning Fork. The psychic frequency emitted from the open, zipper-like faces of the skin binders was a weapon of absolute neural destruction. It wasn't a sound that could be blocked by covering your ears, it was a parasitic vibration that drilled directly into the cerebral cortex, designed to completely shatter the mind. On the rusted flight deck of the ascending aircraft carrier, Pai-Yin Sang-wook, a man who had endured unimaginable physical torture in his life, was driven to his knees. The scarred fighter gripped his head, his knuckles turning white as blood poured freely from his nose and ears. Above him, Bong-sok writhed mid-air, clutching his yellow raincoat, screaming as the psychic pressure squeezed his brain like a vice. Inside the civilian ferry, the terrified survivors wailed in unison, their minds unraveling. Even the immortal Zhang Juwan staggered against a bulkhead, his rapid cellular regeneration unable to heal a wound that was purely psychological. Only two beings remained unaffected. Director Choi Jin-won stood inside the ferry, surrounded by a swirling vortex of white-hot plasma that acted as a thermal shield, burning the psychic frequency out of the air before it could reach his mind. And out on the flight deck, entirely exposed to the crimson light of hundreds of harvesters, stood Sebastian Brown. His pain nullification was an absolute override. The system had permanently severed the neural pathways that translated trauma into agony. His brain registered the catastrophic psychic invasion simply as a dull, irritating hum like a buzzing fluorescent light. But Sebastian knew he couldn't kill 300 skin binders one by one before Sang-wook's brain hemorrhaged. He needed an area of effect disruption, and he needed it immediately. He looked down at the massive, rusted steel expanse of the flight deck. Metal conducts vibration, Sebastian calculated, a cold, predatory glint in his eyes. I don't need to hit them. I just need to hit the floor. Active skill, gravitational anchor engaged. Sebastian manipulated his mass, instantly becoming as dense as a depleted uranium core. He locked himself to the rusted steel deck, his boots groaning under his own impossible weight. Active skill, sonic dissonance engaged. Active skill, seismic tremor engaged. He didn't aim his high-frequency scream at the monsters. He opened his mouth and unleashed the concentrated cone of sonic violence directly at his own feet, right at the solid steel of the flight deck. At the exact same millisecond he drove his heavy boot down with 500% enhanced kinetic strength. The result was a catastrophic manipulation of physics. Sebastian turned the entire flight deck of the ancient aircraft carrier into a colossal, thousands of tons tuning fork. A localized, devastating shockwave of kinetic and sonic energy rippled outward through the metal. The steel deck violently vibrated, emitting a deafening, low-frequency counter-resonance that completely shattered the psychic frequency of the skin binders. The crimson light radiating from the harvesters' faces flickered and died. The monsters shrieked in confusion and sudden physical agony, their delicate, skin-wrapped bodies violently shaken by the vibrating floor. Dozens of them lost their footing, collapsing onto the rusted steel. The psychic pressure vanished instantly. Sang-wook hit the deck, gasping for air. He wiped a thick smear of blood from his upper lip, his dark eyes snapping open. The confusion in the scarred man's gaze was instantly replaced by pure, unadulterated rage. I hate loud noises, Sang-wook growled, his voice a gravelly rasp. He pushed himself up, gripping the handle of his massive sledgehammer with both hands. He didn't run, he marched forward like an unstoppable juggernaut. A recovering skin binder lunged at him, whipping a hooked chain. Sang-wook didn't even flinch. He let the chain wrap around his forearm, the hooks biting deep into his flesh. Using the monster's own chain, Sang-wook yanked the creature forward, stepping into the swing and bringing his sledgehammer around in a brutal, horizontal arc. The heavy steel head of the hammer connected with the monster's featureless face. completely obliterating its skull in a spray of black ichor. Above them, Bong Sok had stopped screaming. The chubby teenager floated 10 feet in the air, hyperventilating. He looked down at Sang-wook crushing skulls, then at Sebastian, who had deactivated his gravitational anchor and was now gliding through the enemy ranks using void step, effortlessly bisecting monsters with his massive bone scythe. "I have to help," Bong Sok muttered, tears still streaming down his face. "I can't just float here." The boy looked around frantically. Scattered across the flight deck were massive chunks of concrete and rusted metal debris from the apocalyptic ruin of Donghae Port. Bong Sok floated over to a massive, 1,000-pound concrete barricade. He grabbed the edges of the block. He couldn't lift it normally, but his power wasn't super strength, it was the manipulation of his own buoyancy and gravity. He made himself lighter than air, effectively turning his body into a massive, lifting balloon. Slowly, the massive concrete block lifted off the deck. Bong Sok floated 20 feet above a dense cluster of 5 harvesters. "Look out below," he screamed, dropping his weight back to normal. The 1,000-pound block of concrete plummeted, crushing the 5 skin binders flat against the flight deck with a sickening crunch. Sebastian, spinning his abyssal bone scythe to shake off the black blood, glanced up at the floating kid in the yellow raincoat. "Not entirely useless," Sebastian noted. Between Sang-wook's brutal, tank-like melee strikes, Bong Sok's aerial bombardments, and Sebastian's hyper-lethal speed, the swarm of harvesters on the deck was rapidly being reduced to a carpet of mangled flesh and broken chains. Inside the ferry, the sudden silence of the psychic attack allowed Ju-won and Tae-hoon to push forward, securing the cargo hold while Director Choi's plasma spears incinerated any monster foolish enough to try and breach the hull. But the victory on the deck was overshadowed by a terrifying reality. The massive fleshy chains pulling the aircraft carrier upward finally crested the violent purple cloud layer. The carrier breached the atmosphere of the floating city. The sky above was no longer empty. The Gothic metropolis was directly overhead, a sprawling, inverted nightmare of towering spires carved from black stone and massive bridges constructed from the ribs of dead leviathans. Sickly green and violent violet fires burned in the windows of the impossible architecture. The sheer scale of the city was suffocating. As the carrier was pulled directly into the central docking bay of the floating metropolis, a massive, gaping cavern lined with jagged stalactites, the heavy fleshy chains began to slow. Clunk! 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 Massive locking mechanisms, forged from rusted iron and bone, snapped around the edges of the flight deck, securing the carrier in place. They had arrived at the slaughterhouse. Sebastian stood in the center of the bloody deck, the bone scythe resting easily on his shoulder. He looked toward the massive, open gates of the city's docking bay. The shadows within the gates shifted. A slow, rhythmic sound echoed across the flight deck. It sounded like heavy boots dragging across iron, accompanied by the agonizing screech of scraping metal. Critical alert, Apex Warden detected. Entity type, the Iron Maiden. Origin, the Abyss/Human amalgamation. Threat level, catastrophic. Stepping out from the shadows of the Gothic city was a monstrosity that made the rust crawler look like a house pet. It was a humanoid entity towering 15 feet tall, entirely encased in a heavily rusted, medieval Iron Maiden torture device. The spiked metal casket served as its torso, dripping with centuries of dried blood. Its arms and legs were composed of tightly wound, razor-sharp barbed wire and heavy iron chains, ending in massive, spiked gauntlets. But the most horrifying feature was its head. Protruding from the top of the rusted casket was a tangled mass of long, black hair, obscuring a pale, weeping face composed entirely of fused, screaming human mouths. The harvest. A chorus of overlapping, weeping voices echoed from the warden. The harvest must be processed. The Iron Maiden raised one of its massive, barbed wire arms. The heavy iron chains rattled violently. Suddenly, the rusted steel of the aircraft carrier's flight deck began to bend and tear. The warden wasn't just physically strong, it possessed localized ferrokinesis, the ability to manipulate metal. Massive, jagged spikes of rusted steel violently erupted from the floor of the deck, shooting directly toward Sebastian, Sang-wook, and the hovering Bong-sok. "Move!" Sebastian roared. Sang-wook rolled heavily to the side as a 10-foot steel spike impaled the spot where he had just been standing. Bong-sok shrieked, floating rapidly upward to dodge a barrage of metal spears shooting from the floor like lethal stalagmites. Sebastian triggered his void step, gliding effortlessly through the maze of erupting steel spikes. He closed the distance to the towering warden in seconds, his 500% enhanced muscles coiling tight. He leaped into the air, bringing the massive abyssal bone scythe down in a devastating overhead strike aimed directly at the weeping, multi-mouthed face atop the rusted casket. The blade struck, but it didn't cut flesh. The Iron Maiden's barbed wire arm snapped up with blinding speed, catching the heavy bone scythe in its spiked gauntlet. The sheer kinetic impact sent a shockwave through the air, but the warden didn't budge an inch. "Flesh is temporary," the weeping mouths whispered, echoing directly in Sebastian's mind. "Iron is eternal." The warden's other arm shot forward, the rusted iron chains wrapping tightly around Sebastian's torso, the razor-sharp barbs instantly slicing through his uniform and biting into his thermal carapace. Before Sebastian could trigger a neural stitch or a gravitational anchor, the Iron Maiden hurled him across the flight deck with the force of a cannon. Sebastian skipped across the rusted metal like a stone across a pond, crashing violently through the rusted control tower of the aircraft carrier. The massive structure collapsed on top of him in a deafening avalanche of twisted steel and shattered glass. "Kid!" Sang-wook yelled, charging forward, his sledgehammer raised high to crush the warden's legs. But the Iron Maiden simply stomped its heavy boot against the deck. The metal floor rippled like water, sending a tidal wave of solid steel crashing into Sang-wook, throwing the scarred fighter backward. From the shadows of the collapsed control tower, absolute silence reigned. Then, the blue system screen flickered to life in the darkness beneath the rubble. "Host status, critical internal injuries detected. Skeletal fortification breached. Warning, current strength output insufficient to bypass entity's ferrokinetic defense. Emergency protocol initiated, skill synthesis unlocked. Would you like to fuse kinetic-and seismic tremor into a singular, localized impact skill?" Beneath the crushed steel, Sebastian's eyes snapped open in the darkness. His ribs were fractured, and he was bleeding heavily, but his pain nullification kept his heart rate perfectly steady. "Yes," Sebastian whispered, a terrifying, bloody smile stretching across his face. "Fuse them. Let's see how much pressure this eternal iron can take." Chapter 22, Kinetic Detonation and the Molten Rain. In the pitch-black void beneath the collapsed control tower, the heavy scent of rusted steel and Sebastian's own blood filled the suffocating air. His fortified ribs throbbed with a dull pressure, the hypercalcified bone cracked but holding together. The Iron Maiden's kinetic output was beyond anything he had faced. It wasn't just physical strength, it was the sheer, crushing weight of the environment turned against him. But Sebastian didn't feel fear. The pain nullification kept his mind as cold and calculating as a supercomputer. "Fuse them," he whispered into the dark, tasting copper on his tongue. The blue system screen floating in the pitch black instantly glitched, rapidly rewriting its own text in a cascade of brilliant light. "Skill synthesis acknowledged. Fusing kinetic-and seismic tremor, warning, the resulting skill will place immense strain on the host's cellular structure. Skeletal fortification will be tested to its absolute limit. Success. Host has acquired the active skill, kinetic detonation. Description: by violently compressing maximum velocity and localized Seismic shockwaves into a single point of impact, the host can unleash a catastrophic physical explosion. Cooldown, 5 minutes. A terrifying, vibrating heat suddenly flooded Sebastian's core. It felt like he had swallowed a live grenade. The raw kinetic energy desperately wanted to expand, pushing against the inside of his heavily armored bones, begging to be unleashed. Outside on the flight deck, the battle had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival. The Iron Maiden stood like an immovable tyrant, raising its barbed wire arms. The entire rusted steel runway of the ancient aircraft carrier groaned and rippled. Jagged waves of solid metal surged forward like a stormy sea, completely neutralizing Sang-wook's brutal, close-quarters brawling. The scarred fighter swung his massive sledgehammer, shattering a 6-foot spike of steel aimed at his chest, but the sheer volume of the metallic assault forced him backward. A rusted chain whipped out from the chaos, wrapping around Sang-wook's ankle and violently yanking him off his feet. "Get him off the deck," a refined voice cut through the clamor. The heavy blast doors of the civilian ferry were kicked open. Director Choi Jin-won stepped out onto the battlefield, looking completely out of place in his pristine, tailored suit. Choi didn't wait for Sang-wook to recover. The S-class pyromancer raised both of his hands. The single orb of fire hovering above his shoulder rapidly duplicated, forming a halo of 10 blinding, white-hot plasma spheres. "Burn," Choi commanded coldly. The plasma spheres shot forward like meteorites, colliding with the tidal wave of rusted steel the Iron Maiden had summoned. The sheer thermal energy instantly superheated the metal, turning the jagged spikes into glowing, molten slag. The Iron Maiden's weeping faces shrieked. But the Warden was not so easily defeated. The towering entity raised its heavy, spiked gauntlets. It couldn't stop the melting, but it could still control the metal. The molten slag was violently whipped into the air, forming a massive, searing lasso of liquid iron. The Warden lashed out, the molten whip cracking toward Choi and the ferry. "Tch annoying," Choi clicked his tongue, throwing up a localized thermal shield that barely deflected the splash of liquid iron. The heat was so intense it blistered the paint off the side of the ferry. High above, Bong-sok hovered frantically, unable to drop any more concrete. "It's controlling the melted metal too. We can't touch it," the boy panicked. "Flesh burns. Iron endures." The chorus of weeping mouths echoed from the Iron Maiden. The massive entity stepped forward, preparing to crush the entire ferry under a collapsing wave of the carrier's own hull. Suddenly, the massive pile of rubble that used to be the control tower violently exploded. It wasn't a shifting of debris. The thousands of tons of twisted steel and shattered glass were instantly atomized, blown outward in a perfectly spherical shockwave. Sebastian stepped out from the dust. He didn't look the same. The air immediately surrounding his body was visibly warping, rippling with severe atmospheric distortion due to the sheer, concentrated kinetic energy vibrating within his muscles. Every step he took left a cracked footprint in the solid steel deck. He tossed the broken, useless handle of his bonsai aside. He didn't need a weapon anymore. He was the weapon. The Iron Maiden's weeping faces instantly snapped toward him, recognizing the apex threat. The Warden roared, slamming both of its spiked gauntlets into the deck. A colossal tsunami of rusted steel, laced with molten liquid iron, erupted from the floor and surged directly toward Sebastian. It was an unavoidable, crushing wall of death. "Sebastian, move!" Ju-won bellowed from the ferry doors. Sebastian didn't move away. He lowered his center of gravity, pulling his right fist back to his waist. Active skill, void step engaged. He stripped away all air resistance and friction. Active skill, kinetic detonation engaged. The sound barrier shattered. A deafening sonic boom cracked across the abyssal plain. Sebastian didn't just dash, he teleported through sheer, unadulterated velocity. He moved so fast that he left an afterimage in the dust. He pierced straight through the center of the massive, molten steel tsunami before the metal could even register his presence. He appeared directly in front of the 15-foot-tall warden, suspended in mid-air, his fist completely engulfed in a blinding aura of compressed seismic force. The Iron Maiden didn't even have time to swing its barbed wire arms. "Break," Sebastian whispered. He drove his fist directly into the center of the heavily rusted, spiked casket that served as the monster's torso. For a fraction of a millisecond, everything went completely silent. The kinetic energy was so concentrated it momentarily sucked all the sound out of the air. Then, the detonation occurred. Krrr-boom. The localized physical explosion was catastrophic. A massive, concussive ring of kinetic force erupted from Sebastian's fist. The shockwave blew backward, instantly vaporizing the remaining molten steel tsunami and throwing Sang-wook and Choi off their feet. But the forward impact was terrifying. The eternal iron of the warden's casket didn't just dent or bend. It instantly shattered into microscopic shrapnel. The sheer seismic force traveled directly through the monster's metallic shell, completely pulverizing the horrific, fused human anatomy trapped inside. The Iron Maiden was violently blown in half, its upper torso disintegrating into a cloud of rust and black blood. The weeping faces on its head let out one final, fragmented shriek before the skull completely dissolved into dust. The massive, spiked legs of the warden stood frozen for a second before collapsing into a pile of useless scrap metal. Sebastian landed gracefully on the deck. His right arm was smoking, the sleeve completely burned away by the friction, and his knuckles were bleeding heavily. The recoil of the detonation had fractured his own hand, but the pain nullification kept his expression entirely indifferent. He slowly cracked his neck, exhaling a long breath of steam. Target defeated. Bonus, Apex Warden slain. Extracting core ability, success. Host has gained the passive skill, ferromagnetic resonance. Host can now repel or attract metallic objects within a 10-meter radius by manipulating their own kinetic field. Capable of stripping armor or recalling lost weapons. A cold, magnetic hum settled into his nervous system. He flexed his fractured right hand, and the bleeding instantly slowed as his cellular structure rapidly adapted to the new ability. On the deck, Sang-wook slowly pushed himself up, leaning heavily on his sledgehammer. The scarred man stared at Sebastian with a mixture of profound respect and genuine caution. "Remind me never to get into a fist fight with you, kid." Director Choi brushed the dust off his suit jacket, walking slowly toward the pile of scrap metal. "Brute force," Choi sneered slightly, though his eyes betrayed his awe. "Unrefined, but undeniably effective. It seems we have a genuine monster on our side." "I'm not on your side," Sebastian replied coldly, turning his back on the S-class superhuman. "We just happen to be shooting at the same targets." Before Choi could retort, the atmosphere shifted. The massive, interlocking fleshy chains that held the aircraft carrier to the floating Gothic metropolis began to hum. Above them, the colossal, jagged gates of the city's docking bay, which had been shrouded in shadow, began to slowly grind open. The sound was deafening, like the groaning of a dying planet. A sickly, pale green light spilled out from the city, bathing the bloody flight deck in a ghostly glow. Bong-sok, who was still hovering high above, suddenly pointed toward the opening gates, his voice trembling with sheer terror. "Guys! I don't think that was the boss." From the shadows of the open gates, a slow, deliberate clapping echoed through the massive cavern. Clap! 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 A figure stepped out onto a massive balcony of pale bone overlooking the docked aircraft carrier. It wasn't a monster. It appeared entirely human. It was a tall man wearing a sharp, immaculately tailored crimson suit. His silver hair fell neatly over his shoulders, and his eyes were completely obscured by a smooth, featureless porcelain mask. But it was the aura surrounding him that made the air turn to ice. It wasn't the chaotic, desire-driven madness of a mutant. It was absolute, crushing, and sovereign authority. "Bravo," the masked man's voice drifted down, smooth and cultured, echoing perfectly without the need to shout. "It has been centuries since a warden was felled. I must admit, I expected the Leviathan to drag in mere livestock. But it seems we have caught a wolf among the sheep." The blue system screen instantly materialized in front of Sebastian, flashing with a terrifying, unprecedented color. It wasn't red. It was pitch black. "Abyssal Lord detected. Name, unknown. Title, The Architect of Desires. Warning, disengage immediately. Survival rate, 0.00%. Sebastian stared up at the balcony, his ferromagnetic resonance humming in his veins. The system told him to run. But in a city suspended in the sky, there was absolutely nowhere left to fall. Chapter 23, The Architect's Game and the Railgun Retreat. The blue system screen had always been Sebastian's lifeline, a cold, calculating interface that translated the apocalyptic nightmare into a game of survival. But the pitch-black window hovering before his eyes now wasn't offering a strategy. It was offering a eulogy. "Abyssal Lord detected. Warning, disengage immediately. Survival rate, 0.00%. High above, standing on the pale bone balcony of the Gothic metropolis, the man in the crimson suit adjusted his cuffs. The featureless porcelain mask concealing his face seemed to absorb the sickly green light radiating from the city. He didn't jump. He simply stepped off the ledge. Gravity refused to claim him. The architect floated downward, his descent as smooth and silent as a falling leaf, until his polished dress shoes touched the blood-stained, rusted steel of the flight deck. The moment his feet made contact, the ambient temperature plummeted, and a suffocating, crushing aura of absolute authority washed over the survivors. It wasn't the psychic screech of the harvesters, nor the feral bloodlust of the mutants. It was the terrifying, undeniable presence of a god stepping into an ant colony. 0.00%, Sebastian whispered, his metallic sheen skin humming as his thermal carapace fought off the unnatural cold. His pain nullification kept his heart rate steady, but his mind raced. If the system couldn't calculate a victory, he had to change the math entirely. "Do not let the theatrics intimidate you," Director Choi Jin-won sneered, stepping past Sebastian. The S-class pyromancer straightened his tie, the halo of white-hot plasma spheres orbiting his shoulders flaring with intense, blinding heat. "In the end, everything burns." Choi didn't wait to parley. He thrust both hands forward. The 10 spheres of hypercompressed plasma merged into a single, devastating beam of pure thermal annihilation. The beam tore across the flight deck, instantly melting the rusted steel beneath it, aimed directly at the architect's chest. It was a strike that could have vaporized a skyscraper. The architect didn't dodge. He didn't even raise a hand. As the blinding plasma beam struck him, it simply stopped. The white-hot thermal energy swirled rapidly around the architect's chest, condensing and cooling at an impossible rate. Within a microsecond, the devastating attack was neutralized, transformed into a perfectly sculpted, fist-sized rose made of cold, black glass. The architect plucked the glass rose from the air and crushed it casually between his gloved fingers. The shards fell to the deck like black snow. "A parlor trick from a dying world," the architect said, his voice echoing smoothly. He didn't even look at Choi. The porcelain mask turned entirely toward Sebastian. "But you are something entirely unique. The system you carry is a remnant of the old laws, stolen and stitched into a human soul. You devour the abyss to conquer it." Choi's eyes widened in rare, unadulterated shock. His ultimate attack had been dismissed like a stiff breeze. Zhang Juwan and Paiyan Sangwook stepped back, their combat instincts screaming at them that they were standing before a true apex predator. "I'm a survivor," Sebastian replied coldly, his newly acquired ferromagnetic resonance beginning to hum deep within his nervous system. "You are an anomaly," the architect corrected softly. "The Leviathan brought this carrier up here so my city could process the livestock. But I have a better use for you. Kneel, relinquish the system fragment, and I will forge you into my new apex warden. You will rule the ruins of your world from the safety of my sky." Sebastian looked at the massive, open gates of the Gothic city behind the architect. He looked at the hundreds of tons of twisted, rusted steel scattered across the flight deck. A cold, predatory smile crept onto his face. "I don't kneel," Sebastian said. "And I don't work for men who hide behind porcelain." Active skill, ferromagnetic resonance engaged. Sebastian didn't attack the architect directly. The system said 0.00% survival rate for a reason. Instead, he channeled the magnetic kinetic field through his fortified body, extending it outward in a massive 10-meter radius. The flight deck groaned. Thousands of shards of shattered steel, jagged bolts, broken chains, and pulverized iron from the slain Iron Maiden violently floated into the air. The scrap metal swirled around Sebastian like a deadly, metallic hurricane. "Sangwook! Juwan!" Sebastian roared over the grinding metal. "Into the city! Now!" Active skill, void step engaged. Sebastian manipulated the magnetic field, gathering a massive, clustered spear of jagged iron hovering directly in front of his right palm. "Fascinating," the architect murmured, raising a single finger. Sebastian didn't wait. Active skill, kinetic detonation engaged. He didn't strike the architect with his fist. He struck the massive cluster of floating iron. The localized, catastrophic kinetic explosion erupted from his knuckles, acting as the primer for the most devastating makeshift railgun ever fired. Boom! The concussive shockwave shattered the air. The massive cluster of iron shards was launched forward at Mach 4, a blinding blur of kinetic violence aimed directly at the architect. At the exact same moment, Sebastian triggered his void step, completely stripping away his friction, and shot backward, gliding toward the heavy blast doors of the civilian ferry. The supersonic iron barrage slammed into the invisible barrier surrounding the architect. The sheer, overwhelming kinetic force didn't break the barrier, but it pushed the abyssal lord backward. His polished shoes dragged across the steel deck, and a single, hairline fracture cracked across the pristine surface of his porcelain mask. System update: target took 0.01% damage. Survival rate recalculated, 0.01%. "It's a start," Sebastian grunted, landing smoothly beside the ferry doors. "Move! Move!" Juwan bellowed. The immortal man grabbed Jiwan and hoisted the terrified shotgun boy over his shoulder. Sangwook sprinted past them, his heavy sledgehammer gripped tightly. "Crazy kid!" Sangwook yelled, a manic grin on his scarred face. Choi Jinwan, his pride deeply wounded but his survival instincts intact, threw up a massive thermal wall of fire to cover their retreat, turning and sprinting into the ferry alongside Taehoon, who was frantically ushering the crying civilians deeper into the ship. "Bongsok, lift the ferry!" Sebastian ordered, pointing at the massive civilian ship. The hovering teenager, who had been hiding behind a rusted radar tower, swooped down. I can't lift the whole ship. It's too heavy. I don't need you to lift it to the sky." Sebastian yelled, his ferromagnetic resonance still humming violently. "Just make it lighter. Take the weight off the hull." Bongsok placed both of his hands flat against the white steel of the ferry. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, his face turning red as he pushed his gravitational manipulation to the absolute limit. The thousands of tons of steel groaned, the massive ship physically lifting a few inches off the rusted deck of the carrier. Sebastian stepped in front of the ferry. He planted his fortified boots into the deck, lowering his center of gravity. Active skill, gravitational anchor engaged. Active skill, seismic tremor engaged. Sebastian anchored himself, making his mass completely immovable, and slammed both of his hands into the front bow of the ferry. He channeled his seismic tremor not downward, but directly forward. The localized shockwave violently shoved the gravitationally lightened ship. With a deafening screech of tearing metal, the massive civilian ferry slid across the flight deck like a colossal hockey puck, shooting directly toward the massive, open gates of the Gothic city's docking bay. The dust settled where the architect stood. The Abyssal Lord lowered his hand, brushing a speck of rust from his crimson suit. He touched the hairline fracture on his mask. "A riot, then," the architect whispered, the temperature dropping even further. From the shadows of the city gates, massive, grotesque hounds made of stitched flesh and grinding gears began to pour out, their eyes glowing with sickly green light. But they were too late to block the entrance. The massive civilian ferry, carrying Sebastian, the superhumans, and the survivors, crashed directly through the Gothic gates, smashing into the sprawling labyrinth of the floating metropolis. The impact shattered the pale bone pillars of the docking bay, burying the entrance in a massive avalanche of stone and dust. They were inside the city. The ferry screeched to a halt. Wedged deeply into a narrow, Gothic avenue flanked by towering, black spires. The red emergency lights flickered inside the hull. Sebastian stood at the bow, his hands smoking, his breathing heavy but controlled. He looked back at the terrified group huddled in the cargo hold. Ju-1, Sang-wook, Choi, Tae-hoon, Jia-wan, and Bong-sok stared back at him. They had survived the 0.00% odds. They had broken into the heart of the abyss. Sebastian's pitch-black system screen flickered, returning to its standard, icy blue color. Objective updated, survive the architect's labyrinth. Warning, you are now trespassing in the capital of desires. All entities are highly hostile. Sebastian cracked his bloody knuckles, the ferromagnetic resonance pulling a heavy, jagged piece of iron from the rebel directly into his grip. "All right," Sebastian said, his voice cold and echoing in the dead city. "Let's go hunting." Chapter 24, The Iron Jaw Stalkers and the Labyrinth's Breath. The deafening screech of tearing metal finally ceased, replaced by the ominous, groaning settling of the thousands of tons of steel. The civilian ferry was wedged perfectly between two towering, black stone spires of the Gothic metropolis, suspended 50 feet above the cobblestone streets of the abyssal city. Inside the cargo hold, the red emergency lights flickered erratically, casting long, bloody shadows across the slanted deck. "Everyone, stay down and stay quiet," Tae-hoon ordered, his voice echoing hollowly from beneath his dented scrap metal helmet. He stood firmly in front of the reinforced storage container, his massive rotor blade sword resting on his shoulder. Inside, the 20 civilians were weeping silently, clutching each other in the terrifying darkness. Sebastian stood near the massive breach at the bow of the ferry. He didn't look back at them. His eyes were locked on the suffocating, sickly green fog rolling through the Gothic avenues outside. "We are trapped in a steel coffin," Director Choi Jin-won noted, stepping up behind Sebastian. The S-class pyromancer dusted off his pristine suit, his crimson eyes gleaming with cold irritation. The floating orb of plasma above his shoulder cast a stark white light in the gloom. "The ferry is wedged tight. And given the amount of noise we just made, every nightmare in this floating labyrinth knows exactly where the dinner bell rang." "Then we don't wait for them to knock," Paiyan Sang-wook grunted, dragging his heavy, blood-stained sledgehammer across the deck. The scarred fighter spat a wad of blood onto the floor, completely unfazed by the apocalyptic surroundings. We clear a path. We find a building that isn't hanging over a bottomless drop. Zhang Juwan walked over, his massive chest fully healed from the rust crawler's acid, though his suit was entirely ruined. Sang-wook is right. The ship's hull is compromised. It won't hold if the architect sends his heavy hitters. Bong-sok, the chubby teenager in the yellow raincoat, floated nervously near the ceiling, clutching his knees. I can't lift the ship again, guys. I'm totally wiped out. You did your job, Sebastian said coldly. Passive skill, echolocation active. Sebastian closed his eyes, sending a micro-vibration through the crippled hull of the ferry. The sound waves traveled through the steel, pushing out into the Gothic avenue outside. His eyes snapped open. The icy calm of his pain nullification kept his heart rate perfectly steady, but the data his brain received was terrifying. They're already here, Sebastian whispered. The heavy, metallic scratching began immediately. Skitter. Scrape. Clang. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was coming from above, below, and all sides. The sounds of hundreds of heavy, metallic claws digging into the exterior hull of the ferry echoed through the cargo hold. Jiawan pumped his shotgun, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the weapon. What is that? The hounds, Sebastian said, his ferromagnetic resonance beginning to hum deep within his fortified bones. Get the civilians to the center of the hold. Now. Before anyone could move, the ceiling of the cargo hold violently buckled inward. With a sickening screech of tearing steel, the metal roof was ripped open. Dropping into the red emergency lighting were monstrosities born of a twisted, industrial nightmare. They were the size of lions, but their bodies were a horrific amalgamation of stitched, decaying human flesh and grinding, rusted clockwork. Massive iron gears turned visibly. Within their open rib cages, pumping thick, black alchemical fluid through their veins. Their jaws were massive, hydraulic bear traps lined with jagged iron teeth, and their eyes burned with the same sickly green light that illuminated the city. Alert, pack threat entities detected. Monster type, Iron Jaw Stalkers, Origin, Architect's Forge, Warning, entities possess high hydraulic bite force. Severing limbs is ineffective due to mechanical integration. 3 stalkers lunged from the ceiling, their heavy iron paws denting the deck as they landed. Burn them! Juwon yelled, raising his massive fists. Choi Jinwan clicked his tongue. In a contained metal box filled with civilians? If I unleash my plasma here, the ambient heat will cook those people alive in their container. Handle them yourselves. The arrogant director simply stepped backward, crossing his arms and watching. Useless elitist prick, Sang-wook snarled. The scarred fighter didn't hesitate. As the first Iron Jaw Stalker lunged, its hydraulic jaws snapping shut with the force of a car crusher, Sang-wook sidestepped the bite. He brought his sledgehammer up in a brutal, upward golf swing. The heavy steel head connected with the hound's stitched throat, shattering the iron gears inside. The monster crashed violently into a parked car, twitching as its internal mechanisms jammed. Taehoon stepped forward to protect the container, swinging his rotor blade sword and cleanly decapitating a second leaping stalker. But the hound's body didn't stop. Powered by the grinding clockwork in its chest, the headless monstrosity continued to wildly slash its iron claws against Taehoon's crude armor, sending sparks flying. Jiawan, the chest! Sebastian ordered. Jiawan fired. The shotgun blast tore through the headless stalker's exposed ribcage, shattering the primary gears and finally dropping the machine beast permanently. But the hull was completely giving way. Dozens more iron jaw stalkers poured through the shattered ceiling and the massive breach in the side of the ferry. The cargo hold was rapidly filling with the overwhelming stench of rotting meat and hot oil. "There's too many!" Bongsok yelled from the ceiling, dropping a heavy wrench directly onto a hound's skull, doing little more than annoying it. Sebastian stood perfectly still amidst the chaos. He didn't have his bone scythe anymore, and using his kinetic detonation inside the ship would rupture the hull and drop them all into the abyss. But he didn't need to punch them. Active skill, ferromagnetic resonance engaged. Sebastian raised both of his hands, his eyes narrowing into cold, predatory slits. He didn't target the flesh of the monsters. He targeted the very thing keeping them alive. He locked his magnetic kinetic field onto the massive, rusted iron gears turning violently inside the rib cages of the advancing stalkers. "Strip," Sebastian whispered. With a violent, brutal yank of his arms, Sebastian reversed the magnetic polarity. The effect was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic for the architect's hounds. Massive iron gears, hydraulic pistons, and metallic bones were violently ripped completely out of their bodies. Black fluid erupted across the cargo hold as dozens of stalkers were instantaneously disassembled from the inside out. Their flesh collapsed into useless, twitching piles of meat as their internal machinery flew through the air, clattering harmlessly against the walls and floor around Sebastian. Ju-1, who was about to punch a leaping hound, paused as the monster literally disintegrated into flying gears right in front of his fist. "Well," Ju-1 grunted, looking at Sebastian. "That's convenient." "It's a localized EMP for clockwork," Sebastian replied clinically, his hands smoking slightly from the intense magnetic output. "But it drains my stamina. And they aren't stopping." Through the massive hole in the ceiling, the undisputed leader of the pack dropped onto the deck. It was twice the size of the regular stalkers. Its entire front half was plated in heavy, dark iron armor. And its hydraulic jaws dripped with a glowing, highly corrosive green acid. "Critical alert, Pack Alpha detected. Monster type, Dreadhound, origin. Architect's Forge, warning, armor is composed of abyssal alloy. Magnetic manipulation heavily resisted." The Dreadhound let out a deafening, metallic roar that shook the ferry. It locked its glowing green eyes directly onto Sebastian, recognizing the one who had just slaughtered its pack. The Alpha charged. Every step cracked the solid steel deck. Sebastian tried to grip the monster's internal gears with his ferromagnetic resonance, but the blue screen was right. The abyssal alloy plating acted as a magnetic shield. His grip slipped. Active skill, void step engaged. Sebastian glided backward instantly, avoiding a massive, snapping bite that clamped down on empty air with a horrific clang. "Sang-wook! The legs!" Sebastian yelled. The scarred brawler didn't need to be told. Twice. Sang-wook charged from the flank, swinging his sledgehammer with absolute, bone-crushing intent. The heavy hammer slammed into the Dreadhound's front left knee. The abyssal alloy dented deeply, and the sheer kinetic force caused the hydraulic joint to buckle. The monster stumbled, its massive armored head dipping toward the floor. Sebastian didn't miss the opening. Active skill, gravitational anchor engaged. Active skill, nerve stitch engaged. Sebastian spiked his mass, planting himself firmly to the deck. He thrust his left hand forward, burying his fingers directly into the narrow, unarmored gap between the Dreadhound's neck plating and its skull. A blinding surge of chaotic blue bioelectricity erupted from his fingertips, firing directly into the monster's exposed biological brain stem, entirely bypassing its mechanical armor. The high-voltage shock violently scrambled the creature's nervous system. The Dreadhound went entirely rigid, its hydraulic jaws locking open in a silent, paralyzed scream. With his right hand, Sebastian used his ferromagnetic resonance to grab a massive, jagged piece of steel debris from the shattered hull. Channeling his 500% enhanced strength, he drove the jagged steel directly up through the roof of the monster's paralyzed, open mouth, piercing its brain completely. The green light in the Alpha's eyes instantly snapped off. The massive machine beast collapsed heavily onto the deck, dead. Target defeated. Bonus, Alpha entity slain. Extracting core ability, success. Host has gained the passive skill, Abyssal Cartography. The host's spatial awareness is permanently heightened. The host can now perfectly memorize and mentally map any complex environment they traverse, sensing structural weaknesses and hidden pathways within a 100-meter radius. A sudden, sharp clarity flooded Sebastian's mind. The chaotic, claustrophobic darkness of the ruined ferry instantly organized itself into a perfect 3D blueprint inside his head. But the skill didn't stop at the ship. His awareness pushed outward, penetrating the thick black stone of the Gothic buildings surrounding them. He could see the labyrinth. He saw twisting, impossible staircases that led nowhere. He saw narrow alleyways choked with hanging cages. And he saw a massive, heavily fortified cathedral structure exactly 3 blocks to the north, completely devoid of enemy signatures. The ferry is dead, Sebastian announced, pulling his bloody hand from the Dreadhound's skull. He looked at Tae-hoon. Open the container. We are leaving the ship. Are you insane? Jae-won panicked. It's a maze out there. We don't even know where we are. The fog is too thick. I know exactly where we are, Sebastian said, his eyes cold and unyielding. And I know where a safe house is. 3 blocks north. The architecture is thick enough to hold off the architect's forces, and the structural integrity is flawless. But if we stay in this ship, it's going to detach and drop us into the void within the hour. The supports are failing. Ju-won looked at Sebastian, seeing the absolute certainty in the teenager's eyes. I trust the kid's instincts. They haven't been wrong yet. Tae-hoon slowly nodded. The scrap metal knight turned and ripped the heavy doors of the storage container open. Everyone out, he said. Gently to the terrified civilians. Keep your heads down. Stay in the center. Director Choi scoffed, but even he recognized the tactical disadvantage of a cornered position. Lead the way, anomaly. Let us see if your mind is as sharp as your brutality. They funneled out of the massive breach in the ferry's hull, stepping onto a wide, Gothic balcony that connected to the main avenue. The moment Sebastian's boots touched the black cobblestone of the floating city, the oppressive, freezing air of the abyss wrapped around them. Above, the bruised crimson sky offered no comfort. Around them, the towering, jagged spires of the architect's labyrinth loomed like the teeth of a massive, silent trap. Sebastian took the point, a jagged piece of steel gripped in his hand. Stay close, Sebastian whispered into the sickly green fog. In this city, if you lose sight of me, you don't exist anymore. Chapter 25, The Shifting Streets and the Obsidian Sanctuary. The sickly green fog of the abyssal metropolis clung to their ankles like grasping fingers. The black cobblestones beneath their boots felt unnervingly soft, as if the entire floating city was built upon a layer of decaying flesh rather than stone. Sebastian led the vanguard, his metallic sheen skin reflecting the dim, bruised crimson light bleeding down from the sky above the spires. Behind him, Pai-yin Sang-wook and Jang Ju-won flanked the cluster of 20 terrified civilians, while Tae-hoon guarded the rear. Director Choi walked near the center, his floating plasma orb acting as a beacon in the suffocating gloom, and Bong-sok hovered 10 feet above them. Tethered to Sang-wook's belt by a length of salvaged chains so the boy wouldn't accidentally drift into the abyss. Keep the pace, Sebastian commanded, his voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence with absolute authority. Do not look into the alleyways. Do not focus on the shadows. Passive skill, Abyssal Cartography active. In Sebastian's mind, a perfect three-dimensional blueprint of the surrounding 100 meters unfolded in real time. He could see the structural stress points of the towering black spires, the hollow catacombs beneath the street, and the precise layout of the labyrinth leading toward their destination. But the map was behaving strangely. Sebastian stopped abruptly, raising a clenched fist. The entire convoy ground to a terrifying halt. "What is it?" Ju-1 grunted, tightening his grip on his combat knife. "The street ahead just vanished," Sebastian whispered, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the dense green fog. "That's impossible," Choi sneered, stepping forward. "Streets do not simply vanish. In a city built by a god of nightmares, architecture is a suggestion," Sebastian replied coldly. Through his abyssal cartography, Sebastian watched the layout of the city physically rewrite itself. A massive, Gothic apartment block 3 streets over seamlessly slid into a new position, completely cutting off their primary route to the sanctuary. The city wasn't just a maze, it was a living, breathing puzzle box designed to trap and disorient. "It knows where we're going," Sebastian calculated, adjusting his mental map. "It's trying to funnel us toward the central plaza. We are taking a detour. Left face. Into the narrow passage." He pointed toward a claustrophobic alleyway squeezed between 2 towering, windowless monoliths of black stone. "It's too tight," Tae-hoon argued from the back, his scrap metal armor clanking. "If we get ambushed in there, we can't protect the civilians. We won't have room to swing. If we stay on the main avenue, the labyrinth will isolate us and drop us into the void," Sebastian stated, already stepping into the oppressive darkness of the alley. "Follow, or die here." Sang-wook shoved the civilians forward, his scarred face grim. "Move your asses." "You heard the kid." They funneled into the narrow passage. The walls were so close that Ju-1's broad shoulders brushed the cold, damp stone on either side. The fog was thinner here, but the silence was deafening. As they moved deeper into the trench-like alley, Bong-sok whimpered from above. "Guys! The statues are looking at me." Sebastian's eyes darted to the walls. Carved directly into the black stone on both sides of the alley were dozens of grotesque, humanoid figures. They were entirely petrified, their bodies twisted in agonizing contortions, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute, silent terror. But as Sebastian's abyssal cartography swept over them, the system interface flashed. "Alert! Ambush predators detected. Monster type, petrified watchers. Origin, the abyss. Warning, entities remain perfectly calcified when directly observed. Unobserved movement speed is catastrophic. Don't blink." Sebastian roared, spinning around and locking his eyes on the statues behind them. "Everyone, pick a wall and stare at them. Do not look away." Jae-won aimed his shotgun at the left wall, his eyes wide with panic. "They're just stone. They aren't moving." "They only move when you can't see them," Sebastian commanded. The civilians, paralyzed by fear, began to weep, but Ju-1 and Sang-wook instantly understood the assignment, keeping their hardened gazes locked on the right wall and the rear. But there were 20 panicked civilians, and the alley was pitch black outside of Choi's plasma orb. A terrified office worker at the center of the group squeezed his eyes shut, unable to bear the horrific visages of the statues. Skrrr crack. The sound of grinding stone echoed like a gunshot. The man screamed as a massive, stony hand clamped completely over his face, ripping him backward out of the group. He vanished into the darkness of a recessed alcove before anyone could even swing a weapon. The crunch of bone echoed sickeningly down the alley. He closed his eyes. Bong-sok screamed, floating above them. "I cannot burn them all without incinerating you insects," Choi gritted. His teeth, his crimson eyes darting between the stone figures. "You don't have to," Sebastian's voice cut through the panic, colder than the abyssal air. "Active skill, ferromagnetic resonance engaged. Sebastian didn't target the stone monsters. He targeted the structural iron rebar hidden deep within the black stone walls of the alleyway itself. His mental map showed him exactly where the load-bearing supports were buried. He raised both hands, clenching them into tight fists. With the devastating pull of his magnetic field, Sebastian violently ripped the internal iron grid right out of the monolith walls. The alleyway imploded. Massive chunks of black stone erupted outward as the twisted iron rebar tore through the architecture. The entire facade of the alley collapsed, burying the petrified watchers under hundreds of tons of rubble in a matter of seconds. The stone monsters were crushed, unable to move to escape because the group was still staring directly at them as the walls came down. "Run!" Sebastian yelled, dropping the magnetic field as the dust exploded down the passage. They sprinted over the rubble, coughing through the thick cloud of pulverized black stone. The alleyway dumped them out into a massive, circular courtyard. Standing in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by an impenetrable iron fence, was their destination. It was a colossal, windowless sanctuary forged entirely from seamless obsidian. The heavy, double doors were made of solid, unyielding iron, embossed with strange, twisting runes that seemed to repel the encroaching green fog. "We made it," Jiawan gasped, dropping to his knees on the cobblestones. Taehoon and Juwon didn't celebrate. The two powerhouses sprinted to the massive iron doors. They threw their combined, superhuman weight against the metal, muscles bulging, the scrap metal armor groaning under the strain. Slowly, the heavy hinges screamed, and the doors gave way, opening just enough for the group to squeeze through. They poured into the sanctuary, the terrified civilians collapsing onto the cold, smooth obsidian floor inside. Taehoon and Juwon shoved the massive doors shut, throwing the heavy iron locking bar into place with a deafening clang. Total darkness enveloped them until Director Choi snapped his fingers, reigniting a small plasma orb to illuminate the space. The interior of the obsidian sanctuary was completely bare. There were no pews, no altars, and no decorations. It was simply a massive, vaulted dome of flawless black glass. It felt completely sterile, isolated from the chaotic, desire-driven madness of the labyrinth outside. "It's a bunker," Sang-wook noted, leaning his sledgehammer against the wall and sliding down to sit on the floor, utterly exhausted. "No windows. Just one way in. We can hold this." The civilians huddled in the center, weeping quietly for the man they had lost in the alley, but the collective relief of surviving the trek was palpable. Sebastian didn't sit down. He stood in the center of the vast, empty dome, his metallic skin illuminated by Choi's fire. Passive skill, abyssal cartography active. He scanned the immediate perimeter. The walls were impenetrable. The iron doors were secure. The architect's hounds and harvesters were swirling around the exterior courtyard, unable to breach the runes on the building. But as Sebastian pushed his mental map downward, probing beneath the flawless obsidian floor, his breath caught in his throat. Thump! 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 It was a heartbeat. It wasn't a frantic, monsterized pulse. It was slow, ancient, and it was radiating an amount of kinetic and thermal energy so massive that the system interface actually began to distort and glitch with static. "Sebastian?" Juwon asked, noticing the teenager's sudden, rigid posture. "What is it? Are they breaking in?" "No," Sebastian whispered, his eyes locked on the solid black floor directly beneath their feet. "They don't need to break in." He slowly raised his head, looking at the exhausted, battered survivors, the immortal Juwon, the scarred Sang-wook, the arrogant Choi, and the terrified Jiawan. "This isn't a bunker," Sebastian said, a rare sliver of genuine tension bleeding into his usually emotionless voice. "It's a cage." And we just locked ourselves inside with the thing it was built to hold. Chapter 26, The Obsidian Cage and the Ashen Progenitor. This isn't a bunker, Sebastian repeated, his voice slicing through the heavy, stale air of the sanctuary. It's a cage. And we just locked ourselves inside with the thing it was built to hold. Silence fell over the massive obsidian dome. For a moment, the only sound was the ragged breathing of the terrified civilians. Then, they all felt it. Thump. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical force. The flawless black floor beneath their boots vibrated violently. The shockwave traveled up their legs, rattling their teeth and causing the air pressure in the room to spike. Zhang Juwan instinctively stepped backward, his massive hands raising into a fighting stance. Paiyan Sangwook tightened his grip on his sledgehammer, his scarred face twisting into a scowl. Kid! What's under us? Before Sebastian could answer, the pitch-black system screen hovering in his vision violently glitched. Lines of static tore through the text, the interface struggling to quantify the sheer magnitude of the energy signature below. Critical error, scanner overload. Entity type, primordial abyssal. Warning! Warning! Thermal output exceeding maximum parameters, Director, Sebastian barked, snapping his head toward Choi Jin-wan. Put out the fire. Now! Choi scoffed, brushing a speck of dust from his crimson suit lapel. The floating orb of white-hot plasma above his shoulder illuminated his arrogant smirk. You presume to give me orders, boy? Whatever is down there is trapped beneath solid obsidian. If it shows its face, I will reduce it to ash. It feeds on heat, you arrogant fool! Sebastian roared, stepping forward. Thump! The second heartbeat was deafening. Suddenly, the solid, windowless obsidian floor beneath their feet began to change. The flawless black glass shifted, turning terrifyingly translucent. Everyone in the sanctuary looked down. Suspended in a massive, subterranean cavern directly beneath the dome was a nightmare that defied comprehension. It was a humanoid entity, curled into a fetal position, easily 30 feet tall. Its body was entirely composed of cracked, charcoal-like stone, glowing from within with a blindingly intense white fire. Massive chains of dark, rusted alchemical iron bound the creature to the floor of the cavern, piercing directly through its stone flesh. My God, Jiawan whimpered, dropping his shotgun. What did I say about using that word? Juwan muttered, his eyes wide with absolute dread. The entity wasn't dead. Its chest heaved. Through the translucent floor, they watched as the colossal creature slowly opened its eyes. There were no pupils, only twin supernovas of raw, churning thermal energy. It looked directly up at the tiny, glowing orb of plasma floating above Choi Jin-wan's shoulder. System recovered, Apex Primordial detected. Name, the Ashen Progenitor, desire, to consume. The Sun, threat level, unquantifiable. Entity absorbs all thermal and kinetic energy. It sees the light, Sebastian whispered. The Ashen Progenitor unhinged its jaw and let out a silent roar. The ambient temperature inside the obsidian dome instantly skyrocketed. The air grew so hot that it became difficult to breathe, blistering the lungs of the civilians who began to cough and collapse in the center of the room. Down below, the colossal entity flexed its arms. The massive iron chains holding it down glowed cherry red, then white, melting like butter under the sheer thermal output of the beast. It's breaking loose! Sangwook yelled, backing away from the center of the floor. I will handle this, Choi said coldly, his ego refusing to back down. The NIS director raised both hands, summoning 10 massive spears of compressed plasma, illuminating the dome in blinding light. I am the master of fire. It will yield to me. Choi, don't! Sebastian yelled, his muscles coiling to intervene. But Choi unleashed the barrage. The 10 plasma spears shot straight down, piercing the obsidian floor and plunging directly into the subterranean chamber, striking the ashen progenitor squarely in the chest. An explosion of thermal energy rocked the sanctuary. But there was no scream of pain from the monster. Through the shattered floor, they watched in horror as the white-hot plasma was instantly absorbed into the creature's cracked, charcoal skin. The entity's internal fire flared violently, growing twice as bright. Choi hadn't injured it, he had fed a starving god. The ashen progenitor raised its massive fists and punched the ceiling of its cavern. The obsidian floor of the sanctuary exploded. A geyser of shattered black glass and blinding white fire erupted into the center of the dome. The shockwave threw Choi backward, sending the director crashing into the iron doors. Ju-won and Sang-wook were knocked off their feet, sliding across the slick stone. "Protect the civilians!" Tae-hoon roared, diving in front of the huddled group of 20 survivors. The scrap metal knight raised his massive rotor blade sword, using his broad armored back to shield them from the shower of molten glass and searing heat. From the gaping crater in the center of the room, massive, burning hands grabbed the edges of the shattered floor. The ashen progenitor hauled its 30-foot frame up into the sanctuary. The ambient heat was apocalyptic. The scrap metal on Tae-hoon's armor began to glow red. "Guns won't work. Hammers won't work." Sebastian yelled over the roaring flames, his thermal carapace working overtime to keep his flesh from boiling off his bones. "It absorbs kinetic impact and heat. We have to bind it." "How the hell do we bind that?" Sang-wook coughed, shielding his face from the intense heat as he scrambled to his feet. Sebastian's eyes locked onto the massive, melted iron chain still dangling from the creature's wrists. "With its own leash," Sebastian commanded. "Active skill, void step engaged." Sebastian didn't run away, he glided silently through the blistering heat, diving directly toward the towering inferno of the primordial. He stripped away air resistance, becoming a frictionless phantom. The ashen progenitor swung a massive, burning fist at him. The sheer wind pressure from the swing carried a wave of fire that melted the obsidian wall behind Sebastian. But Sebastian was already under the creature's guard. Active skill, ferromagnetic resonance engaged. Sebastian raised both hands, his metallic skin humming violently. He locked his magnetic field onto the massive, dangling iron chains fused to the creature's right wrist. With a brutal, agonizing pull, Sebastian manipulated the magnetic polarity. He forced the massive chain to whip upward, wrapping violently around the monster's own throat. "Ju-won! Sang-wook! Grab the chain!" Sebastian roared, struggling to hold the magnetic grip against the creature's overwhelming physical strength. The two brawlers didn't hesitate. Ju-won and Sang-wook charged through the heat, ignoring the blistering burns forming on their skin. They grabbed the massive iron links of the chain now wrapped around the beast's neck. "Pull!" Ju-won bellowed, his muscles bulging impossibly, tearing his ruined suit to shreds as his supernatural strength flared. Sang-wook roared, digging his boots into the shattered glass, pulling with every ounce of his grit and rage. The massive creature staggered backward, choking on its own iron leash. "Bong-soak!" Sebastian yelled, maintaining his magnetic grip on the metal. "Make it heavy!" Hovering near the ceiling, crying out from the intense heat, Bong-soak raised his hands. The floating boy targeted the massive primordial and reversed his own power. He didn't lift the creature, he multiplied its gravitational weight. The ashen progenitor groaned as its physical mass quadrupled. The floor beneath its feet cracked completely, unable to support the sudden, crushing weight. The beast fell to its knees, the fire inside its chest flickering erratically as the chain tightened around its throat. "It's working!" Jae-won yelled, covering his face from the heat. "No, it isn't," Sebastian whispered, his eyes narrowing. The system screen flashed violently red. "Warning, critical core overload." Entity is preparing an omnidirectional thermal purge. Detonation in 10 seconds. The ashen progenitor wasn't choking. It was compressing. The white fire inside its charcoal chest began to condense into a single, terrifying point of absolute, blinding light. It was preparing to explode, taking the entire sanctuary and everyone inside with it. It's going to blow. Sebastian roared. We have to break the roof. The roof is 3 feet of solid obsidian. Choi yelled from the back of the room, pulling himself up, his pride shattered but his mind sharp. Nothing can break it. I can, Sebastian said, his voice cold as ice. He dropped his ferromagnetic resonance, releasing the chain. Sebastian spun around, locking his eyes on Choi Jin-wan. Director. Throw everything you have at me. Every ounce of plasma, right at my chest. Choi hesitated for a fraction of a second, staring at the lunatic teenager. It will vaporize you. Do it. Sebastian roared. Choi raised his hands, a manic grin spreading across his face. With pleasure. The S-class pyromancer unleashed a massive, continuous torrent of hypercompressed plasma directly at Sebastian. The blinding beam struck Sebastian squarely in the chest. The heat was unfathomable. The sheer kinetic impact of the plasma beam drove Sebastian backward, skidding across the obsidian floor. But Sebastian didn't burn. Passive skill, thermal carapace active. Warning, maximum thermal capacity reached. Host cell structure destabilizing. Sebastian's skin turned glowing, blinding white. He was absorbing the director's ultimate attack, using his body as a living battery. Active skill, gravitational anchor engaged. He stopped his backward slide, locking his mass to the floor. He aimed his body directly upward, toward the center of the vaulted obsidian dome. Get down! Sebastian screamed to the room. Active skill, kinetic detonation engaged. Sebastian leaped straight up. He didn't just unleash kinetic force. This time, he combined the catastrophic physical explosion of his kinetic detonation with the unfathomable thermal energy he had just absorbed from Choi. He soared through the air like a localized supernova, slamming both of his fists directly into the zenith of the obsidian ceiling. Krrr boom. The impact defied description. The sheer kinetic and thermal force shattered the impenetrable obsidian roof of the sanctuary into millions of razor-sharp fragments. A massive, gaping hole was blown completely through the top of the dome, revealing the bruised crimson sky of the abyssal city above. At the exact same moment, the ashen progenitor detonated below them. The thermal purge erupted outward, incinerating the entire interior of the sanctuary. But because Sebastian had blown the roof wide open, the path of least resistance for the catastrophic explosion was straight up. The pillar of white fire shot through the shattered roof, carrying Ju-won, Sang-wook, Tae-hoon, Bong-sok, Choi, Jia-won, and the 20 civilians upward on a cushion of concussive force and desperate, gravitational manipulation from Bong-sok. They were violently expelled from the cage, soaring high into the Gothic skyline of the labyrinth, riding the shockwave of a dying god. High in the air, completely engulfed in the blinding light, Sebastian's system screen chimed one last time before the interface went dark. Target defeated. Extracting core ability, but as the blinding light faded, and gravity began to pull them back down toward the jagged spires of the floating city, Sebastian realized the architect's game had only just begun. Chapter 27, The Bone Bridge Descent and the Architect's Toll. The shockwave that blew the roof off the sanctuary didn't just save them, it launched them. For a terrifying, weightless moment, Sebastian was suspended in the bruised crimson sky of the abyssal plain. The world was a spinning blur of jagged black spires, bridges made of calcified leviathan ribs, and the distant, swirling green fog of the city below. Beside him, he could see Bongsok flailing, his yellow raincoat flapping violently as the boy desperately manipulated his own buoyancy to keep the group from plummeting to their deaths. I can't hold us all! Bongsok screamed, his face turning a deep, hypoxic purple. You don't have to! Ju-won roared. The immortal man, clutching his heavy combat knife, reached out and caught the edge of a massive, ribbone bridge that spanned the gap between two spires. The impact tore the skin off Ju-won's hands, but his grip held. He swung in a massive arc, catching Jae-won and the drifting civilians. Sang-wook and Tae-hoon followed suit, their armored hands finding purchase on the slick, white bone. They slammed onto the bridge. It was a massive, arching structure, easily 50 feet wide, slick with a fine layer of frozen slime. Below them, the city plunged into a bottomless, fog-filled abyss. Sebastian landed last. He didn't use a bridge. Active skill, gravitational anchor engaged. He manipulated his personal mass, anchoring himself to the sheer, vertical wall of a nearby spire, before releasing the anchor to drop 10 feet and land silently on the bridge behind the group. He was the last one over, and he was already scanning the horizon. We aren't out of the city, Sebastian said, his voice flat and cold. The explosion drew everything to us. He didn't need echolocation to know. The bridge was vibrating. From both ends of the massive bone structure, hundreds of pale, elongated shapes were scuttling toward them. They weren't mutants of desire, nor abyssal entities. They were the city's inhabitants, pale, hairless humanoids with elongated limbs and eyes that glowed with a sickening, stagnant green light. Alert, pack threat entities detected. Monster type, bone stalkers, origin, the city's servants, warning, extremely high agility. Entities will attempt to drag targets into the abyss beneath the bridge. They're flanking us, Tae-hoon growled, his rotor blade sword humming as he stepped to the front of the line. Sang-wook, Ju-won, hold the center. Sebastian ordered. Tae-hoon, keep your back to the civilians. Choi, if you have any fire left, you start burning the bridge behind us. Burn the bridge. Choi laughed, though his chest heaved with exhaustion. We'll be trapped. We're already trapped, Sebastian snapped. The bone stalkers hit the bridge like a wave of bleached bone. Sang-wook roared, his sledgehammer becoming a blur of steel. He didn't bother with precision. Every swing was a pulverizing force, shattering the stalkers' brittle, elongated skulls. Ju-won fought beside him, his combat knife moving with the terrifying efficiency of a man who had spent decades as a government-sanctioned weapon. Sebastian moved to the very front, his abyssal bone scythe carving lethal, wide arcs. He didn't just kill, he moved with the void step, appearing in the center of the swarm and disappearing before they could retaliate. But the bridge was too long. There were too many. A stalker leaped over Ju-won's head, aiming directly for a crying child huddled near Jae-won. Jae-won didn't scream. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger of his shotgun, the blast turning the stalker into a cloud of white dust and bone fragments. Stay back, the boy hissed, his eyes hardening into a resolve that hadn't been there before. They were winning the fight, but they were losing the bridge. The structure was groaning. The sheer weight of the combat, combined with the stalker's frantic clawing, was causing the ancient rib-bone bridge to fracture. It's giving way. Bongsok yelled, pointing at the center of the arch. A massive, jagged crack raced through the bone. Jump! Sebastian roared, realizing the trap. He didn't mean jump into the air. He meant jump into the dark, vertical gap opening in the bridge. The entire arch snapped. As the bridge plummeted into the abyss, Sebastian triggered his ferromagnetic resonance. He grabbed the iron plating of the massive, descending piece of bone, using it as a shield and a platform. They fell. They didn't hit. The bottom. They fell past the spires of the Gothic city, past the hanging cages, and crashed violently into the top level of a massive, abandoned clock tower protruding from the side of a lower cliff face. The impact destroyed the clock tower's roof, burying them in a mountain of rusted gears and shattered glass. Sebastian scrambled out of the wreckage, his metallic skin glowing faintly in the red light of the dying city. He climbed to the edge of the tower and looked up. The architect was standing on the balcony of the Gothic city above, watching them fall. He wasn't pursuing them. He was waiting. The architect raised a hand and snapped his fingers. The entire city of spires began to shift, rearranging itself into a colossal, spiraling cage around their current location. The architect isn't hunting us, Sebastian whispered, his system screen flashing a final, chilling alert. Objective updated, the architect has declared a hunt. Warning, the labyrinth is closing. He's narrowing the maze, Sebastian. Finished. He wants to see which of us is the apex predator. Then we show him, Sang-wook grunted, dragging his sledgehammer from the rubble. Sebastian looked at the survivors, then at the sprawling, shifting nightmare of black stone. Ahead. His ferromagnetic resonance hummed, sensing the thousands of tons of metal hidden within the labyrinth's walls. The maze ends at the center, Sebastian said, his eyes burning with cold, predatory intent. And that's exactly where we're going. Chapter 28, The Clockwork Heart and the Crushing Dark. The abandoned clock tower was a graveyard of time. Massive, oxidized bronze gears lay frozen in a state of eternal decay, while the bruised crimson light of the abyss bled through the shattered remnants of the clock face. Outside, the Gothic metropolis was not just shifting, it was hunting. The grinding of stone against stone echoed like the groans of a dying titan as the architect narrowed the labyrinth, funneling the survivors exactly where he wanted them. We cannot stay here, Tae-hoon stated, his voice a hollow metallic rasp beneath his dented scrap metal helmet. He peered over the ledge, watching the sickly green fog roll through the narrowing streets. The walls are physically closing in. Whatever trap. The architect is springing, the jaws are snapping shut. Sebastian stood in the center of the room, ignoring the encroaching dread. He had placed his bare hand against the cold, frozen iron of the central drive shaft. Passive skill, abyssal cartography active. The mental blueprint in Sebastian's mind wasn't just a static map anymore. As his ferromagnetic resonance pulsed into the iron, the city revealed its terrifying anatomy. It's not just a maze, Sebastian whispered, his metallic sheen skin glowing faintly in the gloom. His eyes widened slightly, a rare crack in his absolute composure. The entire city. It's a colossal machine. The shifting streets, the moving bridges, they are generating kinetic energy. A massive, continent-sized engine winding a mainspring. Director Choi Jin-won stepped forward, the white-hot plasma orb hovering over his shoulder casting sharp, predatory shadows. Winding it toward what? Sebastian pointed straight through the shattered clock face, toward the dead center of the floating metropolis. Piercing the bruised sky was a needle-thin tower of polished, mirror-like steel. It was the only pristine structure in a world of decay. The spire of resonance, Sebastian said coldly. It's a regulator. The architect is funneling all the kinetic energy of this shifting city into that spire. If we want to survive this hunt, we don't just run. We break the clock. Look at the streets. Jae-won panicked, clutching his shotgun to his chest. There are thousands of harvesters and stalkers swarming the main avenues. We'd be slaughtered before we made it halfway. We aren't taking the streets, Sebastian replied, turning his gaze to a heavy, circular iron hatch rusted into the floor of the tower. We take the veins. Jang Ju-won stepped forward, wrapping his massive, calloused fingers around the rusted wheel of the hatch. With a grunt that strained his regenerating muscles, the immortal man wrenched the metal open, revealing a pitch-black, vertical maintenance shaft plunging straight down into the bowels of the city. A blast of suffocating heat and the harsh scent of ozone erupted from the hole. The maintenance tunnels, Sebastian explained, drawing the massive bone scythe he had ripped from the rust crawler. They run directly beneath the primary transit lines. It's claustrophobic, and if we get cornered, there's nowhere to dodge. But it bypasses the surface army. Sang-wook spat a wad of blood onto the floor, hoisting his heavy sledgehammer over his shoulder. I prefer tight spaces anyway. Makes it harder for them to run away. Lead the charge, Ghost Kid. They descended into the suffocating dark. The maintenance tunnel was a cylindrical pipe of riveted black iron, barely wide enough for Ju-won's broad shoulders. The temperature rose with every step, and the rhythmic, distant vibrations of the city shifting above ground rattled their teeth. Bong-sok hovered nervously at the rear, tethered to Sang-wook's belt, trying his best not to bump into the sharp, rusted protrusions lining the ceiling. The terrified civilians clung to each other in the center of the formation, weeping silently. For 20 tense minutes, the only sound was the metallic thud of their boots. But then, Sebastian's echolocation picked up an anomaly. It wasn't the erratic scrambling of a monster. It was a perfectly synchronized, mechanical rhythm. Thump. 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 Hold, Sebastian hissed, raising a fist. The tunnel opened up into a massive, cavernous subterranean junction. The group crept to the edge, peering into the chamber. The room was bathed in a pulsating, sickening violet light. Stretching from the ceiling to the floor were tens of thousands of razor-thin metallic wires, woven into a massive, complex web of kinetic energy. Suspended in the very center of this web was a colossal, throbbing heart constructed entirely of brass, hydraulic pistons, and glowing alchemical fluid. It was the pumping organ of the labyrinth. And it was covered in parasites. Scuttling rapidly along the vibrating wires were hundreds of mechanical horrors. They were the size of large dogs, but their bodies were tightly wound spools of copper wire, and their 8 legs were long, sharpened sewing needles. Alert, maintenance swarm detected. Monster type, needle spiders, origin, the labyrinth's tenders, warning, entities can synchronize molecular vibrations. Sonic attacks. Will trigger a fatal resonance cascade. Don't make a sound, Sebastian whispered, his eyes tracking the frantic, hyper-efficient movements of the mechanical spiders. They are tuning the city. If they sense us and synchronize their needle legs against this iron pipe, they'll vibrate our internal organs into liquid. Jae-won covered his mouth with both hands, paralyzed by terror. But a terrified civilian near the back, overwhelmed by the oppressive heat and the sheer horror of the abyss, stumbled over a loose iron grate. Clang! The sound echoed through the massive chamber like a gunshot. The colossal brass heart skipped a beat. Instantly, every single needle spider on the massive web stopped. Hundreds of eyeless, copper-wound heads snapped directly toward the tunnel entrance. A piercing, discordant shriek like metal tearing against metal erupted from the swarm. They heard us! Bong-sok screamed. The spiders launched themselves off the wires, diving toward the tunnel like a wave of sharpened daggers. At the same time, the remaining spiders on the web began to violently tap their needle legs against the metallic threads. The iron walls of the tunnel immediately began to hum with a sickening, high-frequency vibration. Sebastian felt his vision blur, his teeth ached violently as the resonance tried to boil the blood in his veins. They're starting the cascade! Sebastian roared, fighting through the intense vertigo. Sang-wook, Choi, hold the line! Ju-won, the web! Cut the web! Sang-wook stepped into the breach, a scarred juggernaut of pure rage. He swung his sledgehammer in a devastating horizontal arc, pulverizing the first wave of diving needle spiders into showers of copper wire and sparks. Choi Jin-won sneered, raising his hands. Vibrate this! A torrent of white-hot plasma erupted from his palms, flash-melting dozens of the mechanical spiders mid-air, turning them into harmless drops of liquid slag. But the vibration in the walls was reaching a critical threshold. The civilians dropped to their knees, screaming in agony as their eardrums began to rupture. Ju-won didn't hesitate. Ignoring the diving spiders tearing at his ruined suit, the immortal man charged directly into the massive chamber. He leaped toward the glowing web of metallic wires, raising his heavy combat knife. With a brutal, full-body slash, Ju-won severed a massive cluster of the primary tension cables holding the brass heart. Snap! The sudden release of tension echoed like a thunderclap. The colossal brass heart violently lurched, its rhythm completely destroyed. The resonance cascade in the tunnel instantly died. The terrifying vibration ceased. The needle spiders went into an absolute frenzy. Their primary directive, the maintenance of the city's heart, overrode their desire to kill. The swarm immediately abandoned the survivors, turning back and scrambling desperately over each other to reattach the severed wires and stabilize the failing brass heart. Move! Now! Sebastian commanded, seizing the momentary distraction. They sprinted around the perimeter of the massive chamber, the ground shaking violently as the brass heart sputtered and leaked glowing fluid. They reached the continuation of the maintenance tunnel on the far side, plunging back into the oppressive dark. But the architect had felt the disruption. As they ran, a massive, tectonic groan echoed from the city above them. The very foundations of the labyrinth were shifting. The walls! Ji-won screamed, pointing ahead. The heavy iron walls of the cylindrical tunnel began to rapidly compress. The metal screamed, buckling inward as thousands of tons of abyssal stone squeezed the pipe like a vice, threatening to crush them all into a bloody paste. Bong-sok, fly! Sang-wook yelled, shoving the boy forward. It's too fast! Tae-hoon roared, ushering the civilians through the narrowing gap. Sebastian threw himself to the rear of the group. He planted his boots into the iron floor, lowering his center of gravity. Active skill, gravitational anchor engaged. Active skill, ferromagnetic resonance engaged. Sebastian didn't push the walls with his hands. He pushed them with his mind. He channeled his massive magnetic kinetic field outward, locking onto the compressing iron walls on both sides of him. He roared, his 500% enhanced muscles bulging, his fortified skeleton groaning under the sheer, impossible pressure of holding back the weight of a city. Get through! Sebastian bellowed, blood dripping from his nose as the magnetic strain threatened to tear his nervous system apart. Ju-won, Sang-wook, Choi, and the terrified civilians squeezed through the rapidly shrinking gap, tumbling into a wider, stable access corridor ahead. Sebastian, come on! Ju-won yelled, turning back. The gap was now less than 2 feet wide. The metal was shrieking, sparks raining down on Sebastian's shoulders. Sebastian held the magnetic field for one final, agonizing second to let Bong-sok squeeze through. Then, Sebastian dropped the anchor and threw himself forward. Crunch! The iron walls slammed shut behind him with the force of a hydraulic press, flattening the tunnel entirely. The sheer wind pressure of the collapse blew Sebastian forward, sending him crashing onto the cold stone floor of the safe corridor. He lay there for a moment, his chest heaving, his metallic skin smoking from the extreme energy expenditure. Ju-won reached down, hauling the teenager to his feet with a look of profound respect. You held back a collapsing city, kid. Not bad. Sebastian wiped the blood from his lip, his eyes cold and fixed on the heavy steel door at the end of the corridor. Through his abyssal cartography, he knew exactly where that door led. We're directly beneath the spire of resonance, Sebastian panted, retrieving his dropped bone scythe. But the architect knows we're here. Whatever is waiting on the other side of that door isn't a mindless monster. He gripped the handle of his weapon, the adrenaline washing away his exhaustion. Prepare yourselves. The real hunt begins now. Chapter 29, The Silver Spire and the Faceless. Reflection. The heavy steel door at the end of the access corridor was different from the rusted, Gothic architecture of the labyrinth. It was perfectly smooth, forged from polished, mirror-like steel that reflected the bruised, bloody faces of the survivors standing before it. It bore no handles, no hinges, and no alchemical runes. Sebastian stepped forward, his breathing measured, his abyssal bone scythe resting easily in his grip. "Stand back," Sebastian ordered. He didn't search for a locking mechanism. He raised his left hand and pressed his palm flat against the freezing surface of the door. Active skill, ferromagnetic resonance engaged. The air hummed with a violent, magnetic vibration. Sebastian closed his eyes, sensing the internal tumblers and massive locking bars hidden within the solid steel. With a brutal, twisting motion of his wrist, he violently reversed the magnetic polarity inside the door itself. A deafening series of metallic cracks echoed down the corridor as the massive internal locks shattered under the sheer magnetic strain. Sebastian kicked the door. The heavy steel slab fell inward, crashing onto the floor with the weight of a bank vault. They stepped into the base of the spire of resonance. The contrast to the decaying city outside was jarring. The chamber was a colossal, perfectly circular room, easily 100 yards across. The floors, the curved walls, and the vaulted ceiling were constructed entirely of flawless, seamless mirrors. It was a kaleidoscope of infinity. Everywhere they looked, thousands of reflections stared back at them. In the exact center of the mirrored chamber stood a massive, pulsating pillar of pure, liquid silver. It stretched upward, piercing the ceiling and disappearing into the heights of the spire. "The regulator," Sebastian whispered, feeling the immense, crushing kinetic pressure radiating from the column. The pillar was physically humming, violently vibrating as it stored the unimaginable kinetic energy generated by the shifting metropolis outside. "It's a bomb," Director Choi Jin-won observed, his floating plasma orb casting thousands of blinding reflections across the mirrored room. "The architect is storing the city's kinetic friction here." "But for what?" "For his harvest," Zhang Juwon grunted, keeping himself positioned between the terrified civilians and the central pillar. "If we shatter that column, the labyrinth stops moving. But the feedback might drop this entire city out of the sky." "We don't have a choice," Sang-wook said, tightening his grip on his sledgehammer. "If we wait, the maze crushes us." Before Sang-wook could take a step toward the silver pillar, the shattered steel door behind them violently melted, reforming into a solid, seamless mirror. They were sealed in. Clap! 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 The sound of slow, mocking applause echoed from every single mirror in the room. Thousands of reflections of the architect in his pristine crimson suit and featureless porcelain mask appeared on the walls, surrounding them on all sides. "You survived the crucible," the architect's cultured voice reverberated through the chamber, making the floor tremble. "You collapsed my Iron Maiden. You severed the wires of my heart. I must admit, I have not been this entertained since the fall of your so-called superpowers. Stop hiding in the glass and face us." Tae-hoon roared, raising his rotor blade sword, his golden eyes burning beneath his scrap metal helmet. "I am the master of this domain, little knight. I do not soil my hands with the final execution," the architect's voice mocked. "To stop the clock, you must strike the pendulum. But the spire protects its own. Let us see how you fare against yourselves." The thousands of reflections of the architect faded from the mirrors. Suddenly, the massive pillar of liquid silver in the center of the room began to boil. The liquid metal violently expelled a mass of silver slag onto the mirrored floor. The slag rapidly shifted, standing upright and taking on a humanoid form. It had no facial features, no clothing, and no distinct anatomy. It was simply a towering 8-foot-tall mannequin forged from perfectly smooth, reflective liquid metal. Critical alert, abyssal proxy detected. Entity type, the Silver Vanguard, desire. Flawless reflection, warning, entity is constructed from pure resonant kinetic energy. It possesses absolute mimicry. A metal man. Jiawan muttered, lowering his shotgun slightly. That's it. Don't underestimate it. Sebastian snapped. Sangwook didn't wait to see what it could do. With a feral roar, the scarred fighter charged the faceless entity, swinging his heavy sledgehammer in a brutal, bone-crushing horizontal arc aimed directly at the Vanguard's torso. The Vanguard didn't dodge. As Sangwook's hammer closed in, the entity's right arm rapidly melted and instantly resolidified into a flawless, identical silver replica of Sangwook's sledgehammer. The Vanguard swung. Clong. The two hammers collided with earth-shattering force. Sangwook's eyes went wide with shock. The physical strength of the entity perfectly matched his own. The recoil sent Sangwook skidding backward across the mirrored floor, his arms vibrating violently. It copied his weapon. Bongsok yelled from the ceiling. Stand aside, brute, Choi sneered. The S-class pyromancer raised a hand. Unleashing a massive, concentrated torrent of white-hot plasma directly at the Vanguard. The sheer heat was enough to melt a tank. But as the plasma struck the entity, the Vanguard's chest violently parted. The liquid silver formed a massive, parabolic mirror. The thermal energy of the plasma was caught in the reflective curve, violently compressed, and fired directly back at Choi. What? Choi gasped, barely throwing up a thermal shield in time. The deflected blast struck him, throwing the arrogant director violently against the mirrored wall. Guns! Fire! Jiawan panicked, pumping his shotgun and firing 3 rapid blasts of buckshot at the creature. The Vanguard's head shifted, catching the lead pellets. The silver liquid rippled, and a second later, it fired the exact same buckshot back at Jiawan out of its own chest. Juwon lunged, tackling Jiawan to the floor just as the deadly spray of lead shredded the air where the boy had been standing. It reflects everything, Juwon realized, pulling Jiawan behind the protective bulk of Taehun's armor. Physical force, thermal energy, ballistics. It uses our own attacks against us. The Vanguard stood in the center of the room, slowly shifting its arms back into normal, featureless limbs. It didn't pursue them. It simply stood guard in front of the central pillar, an impenetrable wall of mimicry. You can't defeat a perfect mirror by throwing stones at it, the architect's voice chuckled softly from the walls. Sebastian stepped forward. He lowered his abyssal bone scythe, letting the heavy blade rest against the floor. Then we don't throw stones, Sebastian said coldly. We shatter the glass. Active skill, void step engaged. Sebastian vanished. Stripped of friction, he closed the 50-foot gap in a microsecond, appearing directly in front of the Silver Vanguard. The Vanguard's reflexes were instantaneous. Its arm shifted, morphing into a silver replica of Sebastian's bone scythe. The entity swung with the exact same 500% enhanced strength that Sebastian possessed. Sebastian didn't block it. Active skill, gravitational anchor engaged. Sebastian spiked his mass, rendering himself completely immovable. The Vanguard's silver scythe struck Sebastian's shoulder. The hypercalcified bone beneath his thermal carapace cracked, but his anchor held firm. He didn't budge an inch. The Vanguard froze for a fraction of a second, unable to mimic the sudden, impossible gravitational shift. Sebastian dropped his weapon. He grabbed the Vanguard's featureless silver face with his bare left hand. Let's see you mimic a localized catastrophe, Sebastian whispered. Active skill, nerve stitch engaged. A blinding, chaotic surge of blue bioelectricity erupted from Sebastian's fingers directly into the liquid metal head of the Vanguard. The entity didn't have a nervous system, but the raw electrical current supercharged the conductive silver, paralyzing the entity's ability to shift its form. Sebastian pulled his right fist back. Active skill, kinetic detonation engaged. He didn't strike the vanguard. He didn't want the force reflected. Sebastian drove his fist directly past the paralyzed entity's head, smashing his glowing, kinetic-charged knuckles directly into the colossal, humming silver pillar of the spire itself. Krboom. The localized explosion of raw kinetic velocity slammed into the spire's regulator. The impact was catastrophic. The entire floating metropolis groaned in agony as the central crankshaft was violently disrupted. But Sebastian wasn't done. Active skill, ferromagnetic resonance engaged. While his fist was embedded in the cracking silver pillar, Sebastian channeled his magnetic field outward, wrapping it entirely around the paralyzed silver vanguard. He violently pulled the entity forward, fusing its liquid metal body directly against the ruptured core of the pillar. A perfect mirror reflects what it receives, Sebastian gritted his teeth, his metallic skin glowing white-hot from the exertion. So reflect this. The spire of resonance, overloaded by Sebastian's kinetic detonation and desperately trying to bleed off the city's built-up kinetic friction, found an immediate, highly conductive outlet, the silver vanguard. Millions of tons of stored kinetic energy violently discharged from the pillar directly into the vanguard's liquid metal body. The entity couldn't handle the infinite loop. The vanguard swelled, its smooth silver surface cracking and emitting blinding rays of pure, raw energy. It let out a deafening, metallic shriek that shattered every single mirror in the colossal chamber. Brace yourselves! Ju-Won roared, grabbing Taehoon and Jae-won as the shockwave ripped through the room. With a blinding flash of white light, the silver vanguard exploded into a billion microscopic drops of harmless quicksilver. The central pillar of the spire suffered a massive, jagged fissure down its center. The humming stopped. The oppressive, vibrating pressure in the room vanished. The clock had been broken. Sebastian stumbled backward, dropping to one knee. His right arm hung limply at his side, the bones severely fractured from the recoil, his breathing ragged. The silence in the shattered chamber was deafening. The labyrinth outside had completely stopped moving. "You did it, kid," Sang-wook coughed, pushing himself up from the glass-covered floor. "You actually broke the damn thing." But the blue system screen flickering in Sebastian's vision didn't say target defeated. It flashed with a violently black warning. From the massive, jagged fissure in the center of the broken silver pillar, a single, pristine crimson dress shoe stepped out. The temperature in the room plummeted to absolute zero. The architect emerged from the ruptured core of the spire, stepping onto the shattered glass. The hairline fracture on his porcelain mask was gone, replaced by a smooth, terrifying perfection. "You broke my clock, anomaly," the Abyssal Lord whispered, his voice no longer echoing from the walls, but vibrating directly inside their skulls. "But all you have achieved is forcing my hand." The architect slowly raised a hand toward the ceiling. "If the city cannot harvest you," the architect said, the bruised crimson sky visible through the ceiling beginning to violently swirl, "then the city will fall with you." Gravity suddenly vanished. The entire Gothic metropolis began to plummet from the sky, hurtling downward into the infinite, hungry void of the abyss. Chapter 30, The Freefall Crucible and the Porcelain God. The sickening sensation of absolute weightlessness hit them. Before the sound of the crumbling city did. Gravity didn't just fail, it was violently assassinated. The millions of tons of black stone, Gothic spires, and calcified bone bridges that made up the architect's metropolis plummeted from the bruised crimson sky, plunging into the infinite, hungry dark of the abyss. Inside the shattered spire of resonance, chaos reigned. Millions of microscopic shards of mirror glass floated into the air, glittering like a deadly, suspended galaxy in the dim light. Yin Sang-wook roared in frustration as his boots left the floor, his massive sledgehammer dragging him awkwardly through the zero-gravity environment. The 20 civilians shrieked, tumbling helplessly through the air, completely untethered. But the architect didn't float. The Abyssal Lord stood perfectly anchored to the shattered floor of the spire, his pristine crimson suit entirely unaffected by the apocalyptic freefall. The featureless porcelain mask tilted slightly, observing the flailing humans like insects trapped in a falling jar. Gravity is a law, the architect's voice echoed directly into their minds, smooth and suffocating. And in this realm, I am the only lawmaker. Critical alert, domain expansion detected. Warning, spatial physics are now under direct control of the hostile entity. Evasion is impossible. Bong-sook! Sebastian yelled. He was drifting upward, his right arm dangling uselessly at his side, the bones fractured from his previous strike. Anchor them! The chubby teenager in the yellow raincoat was the only one not panicking. For Bong-sook, gravity had always been a suggestion. Zero-G was his element. I got you! Bong-sook shouted. The boy pushed his hands outward, expanding his gravitational manipulation. He couldn't stop the city from falling, but he could control the immediate space inside the room. He manipulated the buoyancy of everyone in the group, forcing their bodies to become unnaturally dense. Sang-wook, Ju-won, Tae-hoon, and the civilians slammed back onto the falling floor with heavy, bone-jarring thuds. They were pinned to the ground by Bong-sook's artificial gravity, giving them a foothold in the chaos. Smart, Director Choi Jin-won sneered, adjusting his tie as he landed gracefully. The S-class pyromancer raised both hands, his crimson eyes burning with unbridled fury. Now, let us test if a god can burn. Choi didn't use spheres or beams. He unleashed a true, catastrophic firestorm. A massive, swirling cyclone of white-hot plasma erupted from his palms, filling the colossal mirrored chamber with blinding light and suffocating heat, engulfing the architect entirely. The heat was so intense the floating glass shards instantly vaporized. Did he get him? Jae-won yelled over the roar of the flames, shielding his eyes. The flames suddenly parted, sliced cleanly down the middle. The architect stood untouched, a thin, invisible barrier of pure abyssal pressure completely negating the thermal annihilation. He raised a single gloved finger and pointed at Choi. Your fire is loud, the architect whispered. But it lacks depth. The architect flicked his finger. The space between the abyssal Lord and Choi Jin-won violently collapsed. The kinetic force wasn't a projectile, it was a sheer, localized compression of reality. The impact struck Choi with the force of a falling meteor. The S-class superhuman coughed up a massive spray of blood, his ribs shattering instantly. He was thrown backward with terrifying speed, crashing through the mirrored wall of the spire and tumbling out into the violent, rushing void outside the falling city. Choi! Ju-won roared. Focus on the front! Sebastian barked, scrambling to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his shattered right arm. His pain nullification kept his vision clear, but his stamina was dangerously low. The architect slowly raised both of his hands. The millions of floating glass shards in the room suddenly stopped drifting. They all turned in unison, their razor-sharp edges pointing directly at the survivors. A harvest requires reaping, the architect murmured. The glass storm fired. Millions of lethal projectiles shot forward at Mach 2, an unavoidable tidal wave of lacerating death. Behind me! Tae-hoon bellowed. The scrap metal knight threw his massive body in front of the civilians, his heavy armor clanking as he raised his rotor blade sword to act as a shield. Ju-won and Sang-wook stood shoulder to shoulder with him, bracing for the impact. Active skill, ferromagnetic resonance engaged. With his good left hand, Sebastian unleashed his magnetic field to its absolute limit, wrapping it around Tae-hoon's metal armor, turning the night into a massive, highly charged electromagnet. The millions of glass shards, coated in the vaporized quicksilver of the vanguard, were violently pulled toward the magnetic field. They slammed into Taehoon's armor with deafening, rapid fire. Clinks, shattering into harmless dust instead of tearing through the unprotected civilians. Taehoon groaned, his armor buckling under the sheer kinetic weight of millions of impacts, but the line held. "You defend well," the architect noted, stepping forward. He was crossing the room in the blink of an eye, the distance simply folding beneath his feet. "But you cannot defend against the void." The architect appeared directly in front of Sang-wook. The scarred fighter swung his massive sledgehammer in a desperate, brutal arc, but the architect merely caught the heavy steel head in his open palm. Crack! The steel hammer shattered into a dozen pieces. The architect drove his knee into Sang-wook's chest, completely collapsing the brawler's sternum and sending him crashing to the floor, coughing up dark blood. Ju-won lunged, his combat knife aimed for the porcelain mask. The architect sidestepped with impossible grace, grabbing Ju-won's wrist and casually snapping it backward with a sickening crunch. He discarded the immortal man with a backhand strike that sent Ju-won sliding across the floor, his jaw violently unhinged. They were outmatched. It wasn't a fight, it was a slaughter. The architect turned his featureless face toward Sebastian. "Just you and I, anomaly," the architect whispered. "The final piece of the puzzle." Sebastian didn't retreat. He looked down at his broken, useless right arm. Then he looked at his good left hand. "Warning, host cellular structure is degrading. Continued engagement will result in complete biological failure. If I can't beat him with speed, or fire, or force," Sebastian calculated coldly, "I'll beat him with the one thing he can't. Control." "Bong-sok!" Sebastian roared, locking eyes with the terrified boy on the ceiling. "Drop the gravity. Make us weightless again. Now." Bong-sok didn't question it. He instantly released his gravitational hold. The sudden loss of artificial gravity threw everyone back into freefall. The architect, anticipating a physical strike, paused for a microsecond as the environment violently shifted again. It was the only opening Sebastian needed. Active skill, void step engaged. Frictionless and unbound by gravity. Sebastian launched himself off the wall like a human bullet. He didn't aim for the architect's chest or limbs. He aimed directly for the pristine porcelain mask. The architect raised a hand to casually swat Sebastian out of the air. Active skill, nerve stitch engaged. Sebastian didn't try to punch him. As he closed the gap, Sebastian shot a blinding web of blue bioelectric threads from his left hand directly into the architect's palm. The electricity didn't paralyze the god. The Abyssal Lord's power easily swallowed the voltage. But Sebastian didn't want to paralyze him. He used the physical connection of the bioelectric threads as a tether. Using his own momentum and the tethered threads, Sebastian violently whipped himself completely around the architect, slingshotting to the Abyssal Lord's back. "Impudent," the architect hissed, spinning around to obliterate the teenager. But Sebastian was already there. Active skill, kinetic detonation. Engaged. He couldn't use his broken right fist. So Sebastian drove his skull directly into the back of the architect's head. He triggered the localized, catastrophic kinetic explosion directly through his own fortified forehead. Krrr. The concussive shockwave at point-blank range was unfathomable. The sheer physical recoil snapped Sebastian's neck backward, instantly blinding him in one eye as blood erupted from his nose and ears. But the strike landed perfectly. The kinetic force traveled completely through the architect's skull. Crack! The pristine porcelain mask on the architect's face violently shattered into 1,000 pieces, blown outward by the sheer kinetic transfer. For the first time since the apocalypse began, the Abyssal Lord staggered. The architect stumbled forward, his gloved hands flying up to cover his exposed face. A horrific, guttural shriek, a sound composed of a billion screaming souls, erupted from the entity. Through his one good eye, Sebastian, drifting backward in the zero gravity, saw what lay beneath the mask. There was no face. There was only a swirling, bottomless vortex of violent purple cosmic energy. It was a localized black hole, weeping with the stolen desires of billions of consumed humans. The architect wasn't a man. He was a living tear in reality. And by shattering the mask that contained him, Sebastian had caused the tear to violently destabilize. "What have you done?" the architect shrieked, the cultured voice replaced by a distorted, cosmic static. The crimson suit began to tear itself apart, sucked into the vortex of his own exposed face. "I broke the cage," Sebastian whispered, his consciousness fading as his skeletal structure groaned in agony. The destabilizing Abyssal Lord began to emit a gravitational pull 1,000 times stronger than the Leviathan. The falling city, the shattered spire, the floating debris, everything began to violently spiral toward the architect's exposed vortex. Critical event, dimensional rupture imminent. Warning, the abyssal plane is collapsing. The floor beneath them completely disintegrated. Sucked into the architect. Below them, the infinite dark of the abyss suddenly split open. The sheer cosmic weight of the architect's collapse was tearing a massive, blinding white rift at the very bottom of the void. It was a tear back to the real world. The rift. Ju-1 roared, his jaw snapping back into place as he grabbed the unconscious Sang-wook. "It's an exit. We're getting sucked into the vortex." Jia-1 screamed, grabbing onto Taehun's armor as the architects localized. Black hole tried to devour them. Bong-sok, his nose bleeding profusely from the strain, pushed his power beyond its absolute limit. I can push us down. I can make us fall faster than they pull. Do it!" Sebastian commanded, his vision going dark, his body completely broken. Bong-sok amplified their mass to catastrophic levels. They didn't just fall, they plummeted like depleted uranium shells, tearing through the gravitational pull of the dying architect, hurtling directly toward the blinding white rift at the bottom of the abyss. As the white light swallowed them whole, the last thing Sebastian heard was the deafening, cosmic death rattle of the architect's metropolis collapsing into absolute nothingness. They were returning to Earth. But the system's final message before the light consumed him offered no comfort. "System rebooting, welcome back to Earth, host. Warning, time elapsed during abyssal transit, 365 days. The world has already ended." Chapter 31, The ash wastes and the silent earth. The blinding white light didn't fade, it shattered like a pane of frosted glass, dumping them violently back into reality. Gravity, the real, unforgiving gravity of Earth, seized them. They hit the ground with the force of an artillery shell, tearing a massive crater into the dry, cracked earth. The impact threw up a blinding cloud of grey dust, suffocating the air and burying them in debris. For several long, agonizing minutes, there was absolute silence. Then, a blue system screen flickered to life in the darkness, cutting through the settling dust. It was severely glitched, the text struggling to render. "System rebooting, recalibrating spatial and temporal coordinates, location, Earth, designation, Sector 4 Wasteland, dot. Host status, critical. Right arm shattered. Cranial fractures detected. Severe internal hemorrhaging." Sebastian slowly opened his left eye. His right eye was completely blind, swollen shut and crusted with dried blood from the violent recoil of his kinetic detonation. His body felt like it was filled with lead, but the pain nullification kept the agonizing trauma locked behind a neurological dam. He didn't feel the broken bones, but his mobility was severely compromised. He pushed himself up with his left arm, his metallic sheen skin scraping against jagged rocks. Is everyone, breathe, who's breathing? A raspy, blood-choked voice coughed through the dust. It was Paien Sang-wook. The scarred fighter was lying on his back, his chest a horrific mess of bruised flesh and cracked ribs where the architect had kneed him. But out of sheer, unadulterated stubbornness, Sang-wook was still alive, spitting a mouthful of dark blood into the dirt. Jang Ju-won, his jaw reset and his supernatural regeneration desperately working overtime, pushed a heavy slab of concrete off his legs and stood up. He looked like a corpse, his ruined suit barely hanging onto his massive frame. I've got the kid, Ju-won grunted, reaching down and gently pulling Bong-sok from the rubble. The floating boy was completely unconscious, bleeding heavily from his nose and ears. Bong-sok had pushed his gravitational manipulation past the breaking point to cushion their landing, saving them from becoming red smears on the pavement, but it had nearly killed him. A loud, grinding screech of tearing metal echoed nearby. Tae-hoon, the scrap metal knight, was violently tearing the chest plate off his own armor. The heat from the architect's realm and the sheer force of the impact had fused the metal together. Tae-hoon ripped his helmet off, gasping for the cold, stale air. Behind him, huddled in a terrifying, trembling mass, were Jae-won and the surviving civilians. Out of 20, 15 had made it through the rift. Where is Director Choi? Jae-won asked, his voice shaking uncontrollably as he clutched his shotgun. Sebastian scanned the crater with his one good eye. He didn't make the drop. He was blasted into the void. Before we hit the rift. If he's alive, he's scattered. Sebastian slowly climbed the edge of the massive impact crater, his broken right arm dangling uselessly at his side. As he breached the lip of the crater, the grey dust began to settle, revealing the world they had returned to. Sebastian froze. The system hadn't lied. 365 days had passed on Earth. But time hadn't healed the world, it had allowed the rot to perfect itself. They were standing in the dried, cracked basin of the Han River. But the soul they knew was completely gone. The sky above was no longer blue. It was a permanent, bruised twilight, choked with thick, swirling clouds of dark violet ash that fell to the earth like toxic snow. The towering skyscrapers of the financial district were mostly shattered skeletons, but they were no longer made of just steel and glass. Massive, pulsing organic structures, thick veins of black, calcified bone and deep crimson flesh had grown over the buildings, fusing the city into a biomechanical nightmare. The boundary between Earth and the abyss hadn't just bled, it had permanently merged. My God, Ju-won whispered, cresting the crater beside Sebastian. The immortal man stared at the apocalyptic wasteland of his home. A year. We were gone for a year. The military is gone, Sang-wook noted grimly, limping up the slope and leaning on a piece of rebar he had pulled from the rubble. No sirens. No gunshots. No choppers. It's totally quiet. It was true. The chaotic, deafening roars of mutants fighting in the streets that they remembered from day one were entirely absent. The air was dead, heavy, and silent. System update, global parameter shift. Notice, the initial stage of human mutation. Desire, has concluded. The evolutionary bottleneck has passed. Warning, surviving entities are now categorized as apex predators. Proceed with extreme caution. The weak monsters died out, Sebastian read the blue text, his voice cold. The ones that are left, they aren't driven by blind, frantic desire anymore. They've adapted. They own this place now. We need shelter, Tae-hoon said, looking at the exhausted civilians shivering in the toxic ash. We can't stay in the open. Bong-sok needs medical attention, and so do you, Sebastian. We move to the nearest subway entrance, Sebastian calculated, his abyssal cartography trying to map the new, twisted terrain. Underground gives us choke points. Before he could point the way, the ash falling around them suddenly shifted in direction. It wasn't the wind. Passive skill, echolocation active. Sebastian closed his eyes, sending a micropulse into the ruined riverbed. Nothing. The feedback was completely blank. But his instincts, honed in the blood-soaked streets and the abyssal metropolis, screamed at him. Formation! Sebastian barked, whipping around. Ju-won and Sang-wook instantly stepped in front of the civilians, raising their weapons. The ash 30 yards to their left suddenly swirled violently. There was no roar, no heavy footsteps. Out of the grey fog stepped a creature that looked far too human to be a monster, yet far too wrong to be human. It stood on 2 legs, wearing the tattered, ash-covered remains of a high-end business suit. Its body was unnaturally slender, but its skin was a smooth, flawless obsidian. Where its head should have been, there was only a massive, jagged, triangular blade made of polished bone. Alert, evolved predator detected. Monster type, the Executioner. Desire, absolute silence/perfection, warning, entity utilizes acoustic camouflage. Echolocation is ineffective. The creature didn't charge blindly like the mutants from a year ago. It stood perfectly still, turning its blade-like head slowly, calculating the threat level of the group. Then, it raised a hand. Its fingers were elongated, ending in razor-sharp scalpels. Jia-wan, shoot it. Ju-won ordered. Jia-wan aimed his shotgun and pulled the trigger. Boom! The buckshot tore through the air. But the executioner wasn't there. Moment Jia-wan pulled the trigger, the creature blurred, moving with a terrifying, liquid speed. The buckshot hit nothing but empty air. Where did it go? Jia-wan panicked, pumping the shotgun. Sebastian's one good eye darted frantically. His ferromagnetic resonance was useless, the creature had no metal on it. His echolocation was jammed by the monster's acoustic camouflage. He was half blind, down one arm, and his kinetic detonation was on cooldown. Suddenly, a drop of black blood hit the cracked earth right between Sebastian's boots. He didn't look up. He threw himself forward. Active skill, void step engaged. Sebastian slid across the dirt just as the executioner dropped from the ruined overpass directly above them. The creature's massive bone blade head cleaved through the exact spot where Sebastian had been standing, burying itself 3 feet deep into the solid concrete of the riverbed without making a single sound. It's fast! Sang-wook roared, lunging forward with his rebar club. The scarred fighter swung with all his might. The executioner casually ripped its blade head from the concrete and swatted Sang-wook's rebar away with its scalpel fingers. The impact sliced the heavy iron pipe cleanly in half as if it were butter. The creature raised its blade head, preparing to bisect Sang-wook. Not today! Ju-won bellowed, charging like a rhino. The immortal man tackled the slender creature around the waist, lifting it off the ground and driving it violently into the side of a rusted, overturned bus. The impact dented the bus, but the executioner didn't flinch. It wrapped its long, obsidian arms around Ju-won's back. Squelch! The creature's scalpel fingers effortlessly pierced Ju-won's back, sinking deep into his spine. Ju-won roared in agony as his rapid regeneration fought against the severe spinal trauma. Ju-won! Tae-hoon yelled, charging forward with his rotor blade sword. But the executioner was too efficient. It kicked Ju-won away with terrifying force, then spun around, dodging Tae-hoon's heavy, clumsy swing. It stepped perfectly inside the Knight's Guard and drove its blade head forward, aiming directly for the gap in Tae-hoon's scrap metal collar. Active skill, gravitational anchor engaged. Sebastian didn't anchor himself. He threw his left hand out, focusing his localized gravitational manipulation directly onto the executioner's blade head. The creature's head instantly multiplied in weight, becoming as heavy as an anvil. The sudden shift threw the executioner's flawless balance completely off. The blade head plunged downward, embedding itself into the dirt instead of Taehun's throat. "Now! Cut it!" Sebastian yelled, dropping to one knee, blood pouring from his nose as the strain of using his powers with a broken body overwhelmed him. Taehun didn't miss the second chance. With a brutal, two-handed swing, the scrap metal knight brought the heavy rotor blade down. The massive blade cleaved through the executioner's slender, obsidian torso, severing the creature entirely in half. The two halves of the monster fell to the dirt. True to its desire, it died in absolute, perfect silence. Target defeated. Extracting core ability, error, host biological limits. Reached. Ability extraction aborted to prevent neurological collapse. Sebastian stared at the red error screen, his breathing ragged. The system was failing him. His body was completely broken, and Earth was no longer the tutorial zone. Ju-Won slowly pulled himself up from the dirt, his back steaming as the deep puncture wounds frantically knitted themselves together. He looked at the bisected, silent monster, then up at the towering, biomechanical nightmare of soul. "That was just a scout," Sebastian whispered, clutching his broken arm, his voice carrying a cold, heavy dread. "The world ended a